On the night of January 27th, 1986, 34 men gathered around speakerphones in 3 rooms in 3 different states. They were engineers and managers. The subject of the meeting was a rubber ring, a seal about 1/4 of an inch thick. The meeting lasted about 3 hours. It ended with a vote. 17 hours later, 7 people were dead. The Challenger disaster is usually told as an engineering failure. A rubber seal got too cold, it failed, the shuttle broke apart. But the engineering didn't fail. The engineering was understood, completely, precisely, and in advance, by the people whose job it was to understand it. They said no, out loud, in writing, the night before. What failed was something else. Something that lives in conference rooms and org charts and the space between what people know and what they're willing to say to their bosses. This is the story of how a meeting killed 7 astronauts. The space shuttle was held together at launch by 2 solid rocket boosters. They were built in segments, like tin cans stacked on top of each other. Where the segments met, 2 rubber O-rings sealed the joint, keeping 5,000-degree gas inside the rocket where it belonged. In 1981, 5 years before the Challenger, engineers inspecting a recovered booster found something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Hot gas had gotten past the first ring. They called it a blow-by. It happened again and again. Almost half of all shuttle flights showed O-ring damage. The worst case came in January 1985, the coldest launch to date, at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold made the rubber stiff. Stiff rubber sealed slowly. Slow seals let fire through. The engineers at Moulton Thiokol, a company that built the boosters, knew all of this. 6 months before Challenger, an engineer named Roger Boystruli wrote a memo to management. He warned that if the seal problem wasn't fixed, the result could be, in his words, a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. The memo was received, a task force was formed, and the shuttles kept flying. Because here's the thing about a warning that does not immediately come true. Every launch that lands safely makes the warning quieter. 24 shuttle flights had launched and returned. The O-rings were damaged, studied, discussed, and normalized. If you've seen our Apollo 13 video, you know this pattern. Diane Vaughan would later give it a name, studying this exact disaster, the normalization of deviance. But in January 1986, the pattern was invisible to the people inside it, and a cold front was moving toward Florida. The forecast for launch morning was brutal. Temperatures in the 20s overnight, 18 degrees by some predictions, the coldest launch in shuttle history by more than 30 degrees. And more in Thiokol in Utah, the O-ring engineers saw the forecast and did exactly what they were supposed to do. They raised the alarm. A teleconference was called for that evening. Roger Boystruli presented the data. Cold stiffens the rings. The worst blow-by ever recorded happened at 53 degrees. The warmest anyone was now hoping for was 20 degrees below that. In Thiokol's recommendation, the official position of the company that built the boosters was, do not launch below 53 degrees. Do not launch. That should have been the end of the meeting, but it wasn't, because on the other end of the phone line, NASA pushed back. One manager said he was, quote, appalled by the recommendation. Another asked the question that has been quoted in engineering ethics classrooms for 4 decades. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April? Stop and notice what just happened in that room, because this is the moment the disaster actually occurred, not in the next morning. The burden of proof flipped. For 25 flights, the rule had been, prove it's safe to fly. That night, without anyone announcing it, the question became, prove it isn't. And you cannot prove a negative with the data they had. Nobody had ever launched below 53 degrees. There was no data down there. The absence of data, which was the entire reason not to launch, was turned into an argument for launching. Robert Lund, Vehicle's vice president of engineering, would later describe it to the Presidential Commission with devastating honesty. He said, "We got ourselves into the thought process of trying to prove it wouldn't work. We had always been required to prove it would. The rules switched. And, he admitted, I should have detected that, but I did not." Under pressure, Vehicle asked for a break, a private caucus off the line. It lasted about 35 minutes. In that room in Utah, the engineers fought. Boyce Joly put photographs of scorched O-rings on the table. Arnie Thompson argued the physics again. These were not subtle men being politely ignored. They were, by every account, desperate. And then the senior executive in the room, Jerry Mason, said something quietly that ended the argument. He turned to Robert Lund, the engineer whose signature was on the no launch recommendation, and said, "Bob, it's time to take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." Think about what that sentence actually does. It doesn't dispute the data. It doesn't answer Boyce Joly's photographs. It reframes the decision, moves it out of the domain where the data matters and into the domain where other things matter. The contract, the customer, the schedule, the relationship. It tells a man, the person you have been all evening, the engineer with the engineer's obligation, is no longer the person making this decision. Lund hesitated. Witnesses there remember him hesitating. And then he changed his vote. The 4 senior managers voted. The engineers, the men who actually understood the seals, not asked to vote at all. At 11 p.m., Vehicle sent NASA a new recommendation. Launch approved. Same company, same data, same rings, opposite conclusion. The only thing that changed in those 3 hours was the question being asked. That night, Bob Ebling, one of the engineers who had fought against the launch, went home and told his wife it was going to blow up. Next morning, driving to work with his daughter, he said it again. "You're going to have a catastrophic event today." There was ice on the launch pad and icicles hanging from the structure. On board were 7 crew members: Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Kristen McAuliffe, high school teacher from New Hampshire, the first ordinary citizen chosen to fly to space. School children across America were watching from their classrooms. They were never told about the teleconference. That detail is worth sitting with. The people with the most at stake were not in the room, not on the call, and not informed that the company that built their boosters had, 12 hours earlier, formally recommended against their launch. At 11:38 in the morning, Challenger lifted off. The cold, stiff O-ring in the right booster's lowest joint failed at ignition within the first few hundred milliseconds. For a moment, burnt residue sealed the gap on its own, luck holding the line. 73 seconds into the flight, the seal gave way completely. A flame cut through the strut holding the booster, and the vehicle broke apart 9 miles above the Atlantic. In Utah, the engineers were watching on a conference room screen. When the smoke appeared, Bob Ebling whispered, "It's not over yet." And then it was. So what actually happened in that meeting? Not mechanically, but psychologically. 3 forces were in that room. Each one is in every room. First, whoever holds the burden of proof usually loses. For 24 flights, launching required proof of safety. The engineers had overwhelming reason for concern and no way to meet a standard of proof that had never been applied before, because no one had ever flown that cold. The data gap was the danger. The data gap was used as the rebuttal. Watch for this reframing in your own life. It rarely announces itself. It sounds like, well, can you prove that will happen? It sounds reasonable, but it is sometimes the sound of a disaster in the making. Second, take off your engineering hat. That sentence works because human beings genuinely do think differently depending on which role we believe we're occupying. Psychologists call it role theory. The same person, the same brain, the same facts will reach different conclusions as the engineer than as the manager, because each role carries its own definition of what counts as a good decision. Mason didn't ask Lund to change his mind. He asked him to change his self, and the mind followed. Third, the engineers in that Utah room did not stop believing the launch would fail. They stopped talking. They had made their case, been overruled by the question flip, and watched the decision move to a vote they weren't part of. Their silence was recorded effectively as consent. NASA was told Thiokol approved, and unanimity was inferred from the absence of shouting. This is how groups manufacture false consensus under authority, not by changing minds, but by making the cost of continued dissent feel pointless. Every person in that room believed someone else had the standing to stop it, but no one did. Roger Boystroley testified to the Presidential Commission about all of it. The memo, the meeting, the caucus, the hats. Telling the truth cost him nearly everything. He was isolated at work, shunned by colleagues whose jobs depended on the company's reputation, and eventually left, diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. Later, he would spend the rest of his life lecturing engineering students about that night. Bob Ebling carried it differently. For 30 years, he told interviewers that God had picked a loser, that he should have done more. He was 89 before the public flood of letters from strangers, engineers, and NASA itself finally convinced him it was not his failure to carry alone. Here's the uncomfortable truth at the center of the Challenger story. Every person in that meeting was competent. Every person was experienced. Nobody wanted anyone to die. The managers were not villains. They were people under schedule pressure, contract pressure, customer pressure, making a decision at 11 p.m. through a speakerphone inside a framing they didn't notice had flipped. That is what makes it terrifying. A room full of good people, following the logic of the conversation they were in, voted 7 people onto a rocket that their own engineers had said should not fly. Apollo 13 showed what organizations look like at their best under pressure. Problems isolated, expertise trusted, dissent welcome because survival depended on it. Challenger is the same institution, 16 years later, showing the opposite face. Same agency, same species. The difference wasn't intelligence, or courage, or data. The difference was which question the room was trying to answer. So, one question to carry out of this video. In the rooms where you sit, the meetings, the group chats, the family decisions, who holds the burden of proof? And did anyone actually decide that, or did it just shift while everyone was looking at the charts? The Challenger did not explode on January 28, 1986. It exploded the night before, at a conference table in Utah at around 11 p.m. when a question quietly turned around and nobody had noticed it had.